Chapter 1 of the Avalanche. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynn Thompson. The Avalanche by Gertrude Horn Atherton. Chapter 1. Part 1. Price Ruyler knew that many secrets had been inhumed by the earthquake and fire of San Francisco, and wondered if his wife's had been one of them. After all, she had been born in this city of odd and whispered pasts, and there were moments when his silent mother-in-law suggested a past of her own. That there was a secret of some sort he had been progressively convinced for quite 6 months. Moreover, he felt equally sure that this impalpable grey cloud had not drifted even transiently between himself and his wife during the first year and a half of their marriage. They had been uncommonly happy. They were happy yet. The difference lay not in the quality of Hélène's devotion, enhanced always by an outspoken admiration for himself and his achievements, but in subtle changes of temperament and spirits. She had been a gay and irresponsible young creature when he married her, so much so that he had found it expedient to put her on an allowance and ask her not to run up staggering bills in the fashionable shops, which she visited daily, as much for the pleasure of the informal encounter with other lively and irresponsible young luminaries of San Francisco society, as for the excitement of buying what she did not want. He had broached the subject with some trepidation, for they had never had a quarrel, but she had shown no resentment whatever, merely an eager desire to please him. She even went directly down to the Palace Hotel, and reproached her august parent for failing to warn her that $1 was not capable of infinite expansion. But no wonder she had been extravagant, she told Ruyler plaintively. It had been like a fairy tale, this sudden release from the rigid economies of her girlhood, when she had rarely had a franc in her pocket, and they had lived in a suite of the old family villa on one of the hills of Rouen, Madame Delano paying her brother for their lodging, and dressing herself and Hélène with the aid of a half-paralyzed seamstress with a fiery red nose. Ma foi, it was the nightmare of her youth, that nose and that croaking voice. But the woman had fingers and a taste, and her mother could have concocted a smart evening frock out of an old window-curtain. But the petted little daughter was never asked to go out and buy a spool of thread, much less was she consulted in the household economies. All she noticed was that her clothes were smarter than Cousin Martha's, who had a real dressmaker and was subject to fits of jealous sulks. No wonder that when money was poured into her lap out in this wonderful California, she had assumed that it was made only to spend. But she would learn, she would learn. She would ask her mother that very day to initiate her into the fascinating secrets of personal economies, teach her how to portion out her quarterly allowance between her wardrobe, club dues, charities, even her private automobile. This last heroic suggestion was her own, and although her husband protested, he finally agreed. It was well she should learn just what it cost to be a woman of fashion in San Francisco, and the allowance was very generous. His old steward, Mannings, ran the household, although as he went through the form of laying the bills before his little mistress on the 3rd of every month, she knew that the upkeep of the San Francisco house and the Burlingame villa ran into a small fortune a year. "It is not that I am threatened with financial disaster," Ruyler had said to her, "but San Francisco has not recovered yet, and it is impossible to say just when she will recover. I want to be absolutely sure of my expenditures." She had promised vehemently, and, as far as she knew, she had kept her promise. He had received no more bills, and it was obvious that her haughty chauffeur was paid on schedule time, until, seized with another economical spasm, she sold her car and bought a small electric which she could drive herself. Ruyler, little as he liked his mother-in-law, was intensely grateful to her for the dexterity with which she had adjusted Hélène's mind to the new condition. She even taught her how to keep books in an elemental way, and balance them herself on the 1st of every month. As Hélène Ruyler had a mind as quick and supple as it was cultivated in Les Grâces, she soon ceased to feel the chafing of her new harness, although she did squander the sum she had reserved for 3 months, mere pocket money, upon a hat, which was sent to the house by her wily milliner on the first day of the second quarter. She confessed this with tears, and her husband, who thought her feminine passion for hats adorable, dried her tears and took her to the opening night of a new play. But he did not furnish the pathetic little gold mesh bag, and as he made her promise not to borrow, she did not treat her friends to tea or ices at any of the fashionable rendezvous for a month. Then her native French thrift came to her aid, and she sold a superfluous gold purse, a wedding present, to an envious friend at a handsome bargain. That was ancient history now. It was 20 months since Price had received a bill, and secret inquiries during the past 2 had satisfied him that his wife's name was written in the books of no shop in San Francisco that she would condescend to visit. Therefore, this maddening but intangible barrier had nothing to do with the change of habit that had not caused an hour of tears and sulks. Hélène had a quick temper, but a gay and sweet disposition, normally high spirits, little apparent selfishness, and a naïve adoration of masculine superiority and strength. Altogether, with her high-bred beauty and her dignity in public, an enchanting creature and an ideal wife for a busy man of inherited social position and no small degree of pride. But all this lovely equipment was blurred, almost obscured at times, by the shadow that he was beginning to liken to the San Francisco fogs that drifted through the Golden Gate and settled down into the deep hollows of the Marin Hills, moving gently, but restlessly even there, like ghostly floating tides. He could see them from his library window, where he often finished his afternoon's work with his secretaries. But the fog drifted back to the Pacific, and the shadow that encompassed his wife did not, or rarely. It chilled their ardors, even their serene domesticity. She was often as gay and impulsive as ever, but with abrupt reserves, an implication not only of a new maturity of spirit, but of watchfulness, even fear. She had once gone so far as to give voice passionately to the dogma that no 2 mortals had the right to be as happy as they were, then laughed apologetically and guessed that the old Puritan spirit of her father's people was coming to life in her Gallic little soul. Then, with another change of mood, added defiantly that it was time America were rid of its baneful inheritance, and that she would be happy to day if the skies fell to morrow. She had flung herself into her husband's arms, and even while he embraced her the eyes of his spirit searched for the girl wife who had fled and left this more subtly fascinating but incomprehensible creature in her place. II. The morning was Sunday, and he sat in the large window of his library that overlooked the Bay of San Francisco. The house, which stood on one of the highest hills, he had bought and remodeled for his bride. The books that lined these walls had belonged to his Ruyler grandfather, bought in a day when business men had time to read, and it was the fashion for a gentleman to cultivate the intellectual tracts of his brain. The portraits that hung above, against the dark panelling, were the work of his mother's father, one of the celebrated portrait painters of his time, and were replicas of the eminent and mighty he had painted: Maharajas, kings, emperors, famous diplomats, men of letters, artists of his own small class, statesmen, and several of the famous beauties of their brief day. These had been the favorite grandson's inheritance from Macewell Price, and they made an impressive frieze, unique in the splendid homes of the city of Ruyler's adoption. He had brought them from New York when he had decided to live in California, and hung them in his bachelor quarters. He had soon made up his mind that he must remain in San Francisco for at least 10 years if he would maintain the business he had rescued from the disaster of 1906 at the level where he had, by the severest application of his life, placed it by the end of 1908. Meanwhile he had grown to like San Francisco better than he would have believed possible when he arrived in the wrecked city, still smoking and haunted with the subtle odors of fires that had consumed more than products of the vegetable kingdom. The vast ruin, with its tottering arches and broken columns, its lonely walls looking as if bitten by prehistoric monsters that must haunt this ancient coast, the soft pastel colours the great fire had given as sole compensation for all it had taken, the grotesque twisted masses of steel, and the aged grey hills that had looked down on so many fires, had appealed powerfully to his imagination, and made him feel, when wandering alone at night, as if his brain cells were haunted by old memories of Antioch, when Nature had annihilated in an instant what man had lavished upon her for centuries. Nowhere, not even in what was left of ancient Rome, had he ever received such an impression of the age of the world and of the nothingness of man as among the ruins of this ridiculously modern city of San Francisco. It fascinated him, but he told himself then that he should leave it without a pang. He was a New Yorker of the seventh generation of his house, and the rest of the United States was merely incidental. The business, a branch of the great New York firm founded in 1840 by an ancestor grown weary of watching the broad acres of Ruyler Manor automatically transmute themselves into the yearly rent roll, and reverting to the energy and merchant instincts of his Dutch ancestors, had been conducted skilfully for the 30 years preceding the disaster by Price's uncle, Dryden Ruyler, but the earthquake and fire in which so many uninsured millions had vanished had also wrecked men past the rebounding age, and Dryden Ruyler was one of them. He might have borne the destruction of the old business building down on Front Street, or even the temporary stagnation of trade, but when the Pacific Union Club disappeared in the raging furnace, and, like many of his old cronies who had no home either in the country or out in the Western Addition, he was driven over to Oakland for lodgings, this ghastly climax of horrors. He escaped in a milk wagon, after sleeping for 2 nights without shelter on the bare hills behind San Francisco, while the fire roared its defiance to the futile detonations of dynamite, and his sciatica was as fiery as the atmosphere, had broken the old man's spirit, and he had announced his determination to return to Ruyler on Hudson and die as a gentleman should. There was no question of Price's father, Morgan Ruyler, leaving New York, even if he had contemplated the sacrifice for a moment. That his second son and general manager of the several branches of the great business of Ruyler and Sons, as integral a part of the ancient history of San Francisco as of the comparatively modern history of New York, should go, was so much a matter of course, that Price had taken the first overland train that left New York after the receipt of his uncle's despairing telegram. In spite of the fortune behind him, and his own expert training, the struggle to rebuild the old business to its former standard had been unintermittent. The terrific shock to the city's energies was followed by a general depression, and the insane spending of a certain class of San Franciscans, when their insurance money was paid, was like a brief last crackling in a cold stove, and moreover was of no help to the wholesale houses. But Price Ruyler, like so many of his new associates in like case, had emerged triumphant, and with the unqualified approval and respect of the substantial citizens of San Francisco. It was this position he had won in a community where he had experienced the unique sensation of being a pioneer in at the rebirth of a great city, as well as the outdoor sports that kept him fit, that had endeared California to Ruyler, and in time caused him whimsically to visualize New York as a sternly accusing instead of a beckoning finger. Long before he found time to play polo at Burlingame, he had conceived a deep respect for a climate where a man might ride horseback, shoot, drive a racing car, or tramp for at least 8 months of the year, with no menace of sudden downpour, and hardly a change in the weight of his clothes. To-day the rain was dashing against his windows, and the wind howled about the exposed angles of his house with that personal fury of assault with which storms brewed out in the vast wastes of the Pacific deride the enthusiastic baptism of a too confident explorer. All he could see of the bay was a mad race of white caps, and dark blurs which only memory assured him were rocky storm-beaten islands, mountain tops, so geological tradition ran, whose roots were in an unquiet valley, long since dropped from mortal gaze. The waves were leaping high against the old forts on the entrance to the Golden Gate, and occasionally he saw a small craft drift perilously near to the rocks. But he loved the wild weather in San Francisco, for he was by nature an imaginative man, and he liked to think that he would have followed the career of letters had not the traditions of the great commercial house of Ruyler and Sons forced him to carry on the burden. The men of his family had never been idlers since the recrudescence of ancestral energy in the person of Morgan Ruyler the First. It was no part of their profound sense of aristocracy to retire on inherited or invested wealth. They believed that your fine American of the old stock should die in harness, and if the harness had been fashioned and elaborated by ancestors whose portraits hung in the Chamber of Commerce, all the more reason to keep it spick and up to date, instead of letting it lapse into those historic vaults where so many once honoured names lay rotting. They were a hard, tight–fisted lot, the Ruylers, and Price, in one secluded but cherished wing of his mind, was unlike them only because his mother was the daughter of Masefield Price, and would have been an artist herself if her scandalized husband would have consented. Morgan Ruyler the Fourth had overlooked his father–in–law's divagation from the orthodox standards of his own family, because he had been a spectacular financial success, bringing home ropes of enormous pearls from India, in addition to the fantastic sums paid him by enraptured native princes. But while Morgan Ruyler believed that rich men should work and make their sons work, if only because an idle class was both out of place in a republic and conducive to unrest in the masses, it was quite otherwise with women. They were for men to shelter, and it was their sole duty to be useful in the home, and, wherever possible, ornamental in public. Nor had he the least faith in female talent. Marian Ruyler had yielded the point and departed hopefully for a broader sphere when her second and favourite son was 8. Morgan Ruyler married again as soon as convention would permit, this time carefully selecting a wife of the soundest New York predispositions, and with a personal admiration of Queen Victoria. And he had watched young Price like an affectionate but inexorable parent hawk until the young man followed his brother, the quintessential Ruyler, into the now historic firm. However, he suffered little from anxiety. Price, too, was conservative, intensely proud of the family traditions, an almost impassioned worker, and unselfish as men go. 2 sons in every generation must enter the firm. It was not in the Ruyler blood to take long chances. 3. Life out here in California had been too hurried for more than fleeting moments of self–study, but on this idle Sunday morning Price Ruyler's perturbed mind wandered to that inner self of his to which he once had longed to give a freer expression. It was odd that his conservative training, the rigid traditions of his family, conventional, old–fashioned, puritanical, as became the best stock of New York, a stock that in the Ruyler family had seemed to carry its own antidote for the poisons ever seeking entrance to the spiritual conduits of the rich, had left any place for that sentimental romantic tide in his nature which had swept him into marriage with a girl outside of his own class, a girl of whose family he had known practically nothing until his outraged father had cabled to a correspondent in Paris to make investigation of the Perrin family of Rouen, to which the girl's mother claimed to belong. The inquiries were satisfactory. They were quite respectable, bourgeois, silk merchants in a small way, although at least 2 strata below that haute bourgeoisie which now regarded itself as the real upper class of the République Française. A true Ruyler, however, would have fled at the first danger–signal, never have reached the point where inquiries were in order. California was replete with charming, beautiful, and superlatively healthy girls. The climate produced them, as it did its superabundance of fruit, flowers, and vegetables. But they had left Price Ruyler untroubled. He had been far more interested, watching San Francisco rise from its ruins, transformed almost overnight from a picturesque but ramshackle city, a patchwork of different eras, into a staid metropolis of concrete and steel, defiant alike of earthquake and fire. He had liked the new experience of being a pioneer, which so subtly expanded his starved ego that he had, by unconscious degrees, made up his mind to remain out here as the permanent head of the San Francisco house, and, in time, no doubt, marry one of these fine, hardy, frank, out-of-door, wholly unsubtle California girls. Moreover, he had found in San Francisco several New Yorkers as well as Englishmen of his own class, notably John Gwynne, who had thrown over one of the greatest of English peerages to follow his personal tastes in a legislative career, all of whom had settled down into that free and independent life from motives not dissimilar from his own. But he had ceased to be an untroubled spirit from the moment he met Hélène Delano. He had gone down to Monterey for polo, and he had forgotten the dinner to which he had brought a keen appetite, and stared at her as she entered the immense dining room with her mother. It was not her beauty, although that was considerable, that had summarily transposed his gallant if cool admiration for all charming, well-bred women into a submerging recognition of woman in particular. It was her unlikeness to any of the girls he had been riding, dancing, playing golf and tennis with during the past year and a half. For 2 years after his arrival he had seen nothing of society whatever. Later that evening he defined this dissimilarity from the American girl as the result not only of her French blood but of her European training, her quiet, secluded girlhood in a provincial town of great beauty, where she had received a leisurely education rare in the United States, seen or read little of the great world (she had visited Paris only twice and briefly), her mind charmingly developed by conscientious tutors. But at the moment he thought that the compelling power lay in some deep subtlety of eye, her little air of lofty aloofness, her classic small features in a small face, the top–heavy masses of blue–black hair, which she carried with a certain naïve pride as if it were her only vanity, in her general unlikeness to the grey–eyed, fair–haired American, a type to which himself belonged. Her only point in common with this fashionable set patronizing Del Monte for the hour was the ineffable style with which she wore the perfect little white frock. An American inheritance, he assumed after he knew her, for, as he recalled provincial French women, style was not their strong point. When he met her eyes some 20 minutes later he dismissed the impression of subtlety, for their black depths were quick with an eager wonder and curiosity. Later they grew wistful, and he guessed that she knew none of these smart folk, down, like himself, for the tournament, people who were chattering from table to table like a large family. That some of his girl acquaintances were interested in the young stranger he inferred from speculative and appraising eyes that were turned upon her from time to time. Price, with some irony, wondered at their curiosity. The San Francisco girl, he had discovered, possessed an extra sense all her own. There was no lofty indifference about her. She had the worth–while stranger detected and tabulated, and his or her social destiny settled before the Eastern train had disgorged its contents in the Oakland mole. And even the immense florid mother of this lovely girl, with her own masses of snow–white hair dressed in a manner becoming her age, and a severe gown of black Chantilly net, relieved by the merest trifle of jet, looked the reverse of the nondescript tourist. The girl wore white embroidered silk muslin and a thin gold chain with a small ruby pendant. She was rather above the average height, although not as tall as her mother, and if she were as thin as fashion commanded, her bones were so small that her neck and arms looked almost plump. Her expressive eyes were as black as her hair, and her only large feature. Her skin was of a quite remarkably pink whiteness, although there was a pink colour in her lips and cheeks. The older men stared at her more persistently than the younger ones, who liked their own sort and not girls who looked as if they might be "booky" and "spring things on a fellow." There was a ball in the evening, and once more mother and daughter sat apart, while the flower of San Francisco, an inclusive term for the select circles of Menlo Park, Atherton, Burlingame, San Mateo, far San Rafael, and Belvedere, romped as one great family. Newport, Ruyler reflected for the 20th time, did it no better. To the stranger peering through the magic bars, they were now as insensible as befitted their code. These two people knew nobody, and that was the end of it. 4. But Price noted that now the girl's eyes were merely wistful, and once or twice he saw them fill with tears. As 3 of the dowagers merely sniffed when he sought possible information, he finally had recourse to the manager of the hotel, D.V. Bimmer. They were a Madame and Mademoiselle Delano from Rouen, and had been at the hotel for a fortnight, not seeming to mind its comparative emptiness, but enjoying the sea bathing and the drives. The girl rode, and went out every morning with the groom. "But didn't they bring any letters?" asked Ruyler. "They are ladies, and one letter would have done the business. That poor girl is having a deuce of a time." D.V., who knew everybody in California and all their secrets, shook his head. "'Fraid not. The French maid told the floor valet that although the father was American, from New England somewheres, and the girl born in California, accidentally as it were, she had lived in France all her life. She's just 18, never crossed the ocean before. Can you beat it? Until last month, and then they came from Hong Kong, taking a trip round the world in good old style. The madame, who scarcely opens her mouth, did condescend to tell me that she had admired California very much when she was here before, and intended to travel all over the state. Perhaps I met her in that far off long ago, for I was managing a hotel in San Francisco about that time, and her face haunts me somehow, although when features get all swallowed up by fat like that you can't locate them. The girl, too, reminds me of someone, but of course she was in arms when she left, and as I ain't much on cathedrals I never went to Rouen. Of course it's the old trick, bringing a pretty girl to a fashionable watering place to marry her off, but these folks are not poor. Not what we call rich, perhaps, but good and solid. I don't fall for the old lady, she's a cool proposition, or I miss my guess, but the girl's all right. I've seen too many girls in this Mecca for adventurous females, and never made a mistake yet. I wish some of our grandes dames would extend a glad hand, but I'm afraid they won't. Terrible exclusive, this bunch." Ruyler scowled and walked back to the ballroom. The exclusiveness of this young society on the wrong side of the continent sometimes made him homesick, and sometimes made him sick. He saw little chance for this poor girl to enjoy the rights of her radiant youth, if her mother had not taken the precaution to bring letters. France was full of Californians. Many lived there. Surely she must have met some one she could have made use of. It was tragic to watch a pathetic young thing staring at 200 or 300 young men and maidens disporting themselves with the natural hilarity of youth, and but few of them too ill-natured to welcome a young and lovely stranger, if properly introduced. He experienced a desperate impulse to go up to the mother and offer her the hospitality of the evening, ask her to regard him as her host. But Madame Delano had a frozen eye, and no doubt orthodox French ideas on the subject of young girls. A moment later his eye fell on Mrs. Ford Thornton. Fordy was many times a millionaire, and his handsome, intelligent wife lived the life of her class. But she was far less conservative than any woman Price had met in San Francisco. Although she was no longer young, he had more than once detected symptoms of a wild and insurgent spirit, and an impatient contempt for the routine she was compelled to follow or go into retirement. She was always leaving abruptly for Europe, and every once in a while she did something quite uncanonical, enjoying wickedly the consternation that she caused among the serenely regulated, and betraying to the keen eyes of the New Yorker an ironic appreciation of the immense wealth which enabled her to do as she chose, answerable to no one. Her husband was uxorious, and she had no children. She had seemed to Price more restless than usual of late, and showing unmistakable signs of abrupt departure. He was sure she dusted the soles of her boots as she locked the door of drawing room A. Perhaps to night she might be in a schismatic mood. She was standing apart, a tall, dark, almost fiercely haughty woman, but dressed with a certain arrogant simplicity, without jewels, her hair in a careless knot at the base of her head. There were times when she was impeccably groomed, others when she looked as if an infuriated maid had left her helpless. She was, as Ruyler well knew, a kind and generous woman in certain of her moods, with whom the dastardly cradle fates had experimented, hoping for high drama when the whip of life snapped once too often. Perhaps she had found her revenge as well as her consolation in cheating them. It was evident to Price that she had been snubbing somebody, for a group of matrons, flushed and drawn apart, were whispering resentfully. Price Ruyler stood in no awe of her. He could match her arrogance, and he liked and admired her more than any of his new friends. They quarreled furiously, but she never snubbed him. He walked over to her, his cool grey eyes lit with the pleasure in seeing her that she had learned to expect. "Good evening, oh Queen of the Pacific," he said lightly. "You are looking quite wonderful as usual. Are you standing alone almost in the middle of the room to emphasize the difference?" "I'm in no mood for compliments, satiric or otherwise." She looked him over with cool penetration. "I may not massage or have my old cuticle ripped off. If I choose to look my age, you must admit that it gives me one more claim to originality." "You should have let the world know long since just how original you are, instead of settling down into the leadership of San Francisco society." He enjoyed provoking her. Her dark, narrow eyes opened and flashed as they must have done in their unchastened youth. "Don't dare call me the leader of this granted, but the fact remains that your word alone is law. Therefore I am about to ask you to forget that I am a bungling diplomat and do a kind act. For once you would be able to be both kind and original." "I did not know you went in for charities. I am sick of shelling out." "My only part in charities is shelling out." "Well, come to the point. What do you want?" "I want you to go over to that lady, Madame Delano her name is, sitting beside that beautiful girl, and introduce yourself, and then me. They are strangers, and I'd like to give them a good time." "How disinterested of you!" She looked the isolated couple over. "The girl is all right, but I don't like the mother. She is well dressed, oh, correct from tip to toe, but not quite the lady." Ruyler's cool, insolent gaze swept the dado of amiable overfed ladies who fanned themselves against the wall. "None of that. You know I do not tolerate the New York attitude. At least we know who ours are. They came into their own respectability, and with no uncertain touch. Of course it is stupid of them to get fat. Naturally it makes them look bourgeoise. But this is a lazy climate. As to that woman, there is something about her I do not like. She is aggressively not massaged, not made up. Only a woman of assured position can afford to be mid-Victorian. It is now quite the smart thing to make up." "No doubt her position is assured in her own provincial town. It will be easy enough to drop her if she doesn't go down. You can't deny that the girl is all right. And a sweet, pathetic figure." "If the girl marries one of our boys, and no doubt that is what she was brought here for, we shall not be able to get rid of the mother. We've tried that and failed." At that moment Ruyler's eyes met those of the girl. They flashed an irresistible appeal. He drew a short breath. How different she looked! She radiated a subtle promise of perfect companionship. Price Ruyler did what all men will do until the end of time. He made up his mind that he had found his woman, and without vocal assistance. Mrs. Thornton, who had been watching the unusual mobility of his face, met his eyes with a satirical smile in her own, her thin red curling lips drawn almost straight for a moment. She had played with the fancy, before anger banished it, that if she had been 20 years younger. Men had fallen madly in love with her in her own day. She detected the symptoms in this man at once. Her savage will compelled her to accept accumulating years without a concession, but she had forgotten nothing. Ruyler may have read her thoughts. "You know," he said with an attempt at lightness, "although the coast wind tan, which was his only claim to coloring, had paled a little, that girl reminds me so much of you that I have made up my mind to marry her. I don't care who she is. If you don't help me to meet her conventionally, I'll manage somehow. But I should hate to practise any subterfuges on the woman I intend to make my wife." For a moment he had the sensation of being pinned to the wall by that narrow concentrated gaze. Then Mrs. Thornton swung on her heel. "I'll do it," she said. She walked across the room with the supple grace her slender figure had never lost, and sat down beside the older woman. In a moment the astonished dowagers, who had suffered from her fiendish temper all evening, saw her talking with spontaneous graciousness to both the strangers. Madame Delano was at first more distant and reserved than Mrs. Thornton had ever been, manifestly betraying all the suspicion and unsocial instincts of her class. But she thawed, and the two women chatted, while once more the girl's eyes wandered to the dancers. When Mrs. Thornton had tormented Ruyler for quite 15 minutes, she beckoned to him imperiously. A moment later he was whirling the girl down the ballroom and thrilling at her contact. 5. The wooing had been as headlong as his falling in love. Hélène Delano had a deep, sweet voice, which completed the conquest during the hour they spent in the grounds under the shelter of a great palm, until hunted down by a horrified parent. Hélène talked frankly of her life. Her mother had been visiting relatives in a small New England town, Holbrook Centre, she believed it was called, but hard American names did not cling to her memory. She loved the soft Latin and Indian names in California. And there she had met and married her father, James Delano. They were on their way to Japan when business detained him in San Francisco much longer than he had expected, and she was born. She believed that he had owned a ranch and he wanted to sell. He died on the voyage across the Pacific, and her mother had returned to live among her own people in Rouen, very plain bourgeois, but of a respectability, oh là là! But it was a tiresome life for a young girl with American blood in her, monsieur. Her mother's income from her husband's estate was not large, but they lived in a wing of the old house and were very comfortable. From her window there was a lovely view of the Seine winding off to Paris. Oh, monsieur, how I used to long to go to Paris! America was too far, I never dreamed of it. But Paris! And only 2 little glimpses of it, the last when we spent a fortnight there before sailing, to get me some nice frocks. She had studied hard, but hard. She knew 4 languages, she told Ruyler proudly. I had no dot then, you see. It was possible I might have to teach one day. A governess in England, oh là là! But 6 months ago a good old uncle had died and left them some money. She would have a little dot now, and they could travel. Maman said she would not have a large enough dot to make a fine marriage in France, but that the English and American men were more romantic. They went first to the Orient, as there were so many Englishmen of good family to be met there. But maman is difficult to please," she added with her enchanting artlessness, "as difficult as I myself, monsieur. I wish to fall in love like the American girls. Maman says it is not necessary, but I am half American, so why not? There was an English gentleman with a nice title in Hong Kong, and maman was quite pleased with him until she discovered that he gambled, or did something equally horrid, and she bought our tickets for San Francisco right away." Yes, she was enjoying her travels, but she was a little lonesome. In Rouen at least she had her cousins. For the first time in her life she was talking to a young man alone. Even on the steamer she was not permitted to speak to any of the nice young men who looked as if they would like her if only maman would relent. "In our ugly old rooms in Rouen, maman cherished me like some rare little flower in an old earthen pot," she added quaintly. "Now the pot has tinsel and tissue paper round it, but until to night I have felt as if I might just as well be an old cabbage." But it had been heaven to dance with a young man who was not a cousin, and to sit out alone with him in the moonlight. Oh, grâce à Dieu! Travelling, she had read modern novels for the first time. There were many in the ship's library, oh, but dozens! And she knew now how American and English girls enjoyed life. Her mother had been ill nearly all the way over. She had given her word not to speak to any one, But maman had been ignorant of the library replete with the novelists of the day, and although she was not untruthful, enfin she saw no reason to ask her too anxious parent for another prohibition, and condemn herself to yawn at the sea. Ruyler proposed at the end of a week. She was the only really innocent, unspoiled, unself–conscious girl he had ever met, almost as old–fashioned as his great–grandmother must have been. Not that he set forth her virtues to bolster his determination to marry a girl of no family, even in her own country. He was madly in love, and life without her was unthinkable. But he tabulated the 1,000 points to her credit for the benefit of his outraged father. He did not pretend to like Madame Delano. She was a hard, calculating, sordid old bourgeoisie. But when he refused the little dot she would have settled upon Hélène, he knew that he had won her friendship, and that she would give him no trouble. She was not a mother–in–law to be ashamed of, for her manners were coldly correct, her education in youth had evidently been adequate, and in her obese way she was imposing. She gave him to understand that she had no more desire to live with her son–in–law than he with her, and established herself in a small suite in the Palace Hotel. After a lifetime in a provincial town, economizing mercilessly, she felt, she remarked in one of her rare expansive moments that she had earned the right to look on at life in a great hotel. The rainy season she spent in Southern California, moving from one large hotel crowded with Eastern visitors to another. This uncommon self–indulgence and her devotion to Hélène were the only weak spots Ruyler was able to discover in that cast–iron character. She seldom attended the brilliant entertainments of her daughter, and refused the endowed car offered by her son–in–law. Hélène married to the best parti in San Francisco, and quite happy, she seemed content to settle down into the rôle of the onlooker at the kaleidoscope of life. She spent 8 hours of the day and evening seated in an arm–chair in the court of the Palace Hotel, and for air rowed out to the end of the California street–car line, always on the front seat of the dummy. She was dubbed a "quaint old party" by her new acquaintances, and left to her own devices. If she didn't want them, they could jolly well do without her. 6. Hélène's social success was immediate and permanent. Californians rarely do things by halves. Society was no exception. She had walked off with the most desirable man in town, but they were good gamblers. When they lost they paid. She had married into their set. They had accepted her. She was one of them. No secret order is more loyal to its initiates. During that first year and a half of ideal happiness Ruyler, in what leisure he could command, found Hélène's rapidly expanding mind as companionable as he had hoped, and the girlish dignity she never lost, for all her naïveté and vivacity, gratified his pride and compelled, upon their second brief visit to New York, even the unqualified approval of his family. She had inherited all the subtle adaptability of her father's race, nothing of the cold and rigid narrowness of her mother's class. Price had feared that her lively mind might reveal disconcerting shallows, but these little voids were but the divine hiatuses of youth. He sometimes wondered just how strong her character was. There were times when he showed a pronounced inclination for the line of least resistance, but her youth, her too sheltered bringing up, those drab cramped years, no wonder. He was glad on the whole that his was the part to mould. Nevertheless he had his inconsistencies. Unlike many men of strong will and driving purpose, he liked strength of character and pronounced individuality in women, and he, too, had had fleeting visions of what life might have been had Flora Thornton entered life 20 years later. He had been quite sincere in telling her that the young stranger reminded him of the most powerful personality he had met in California, and he believed that within a reasonable time Hélène would be as variously cultivated, as widely, if less erratically, developed. But was there any such insurgent force in her depths? It was not within the possibilities that at any time in her life Flora Thornton had been pliable. A man had little time to study his wife in California these days. Or at any time, he sometimes wondered. Certainly happy marriages were rare and divorces many. Fine weather nearly all the year round played the deuce with domesticity, and his business could not be neglected for the long vacation abroad to which they both had looked forward so ardently. Sometimes, even before this vague grey mist had risen between them, he had moments of wondering whether he knew his wife at all. How could a man know a woman who did not yet know herself? He sighed and wished he had more time to explore the uncharted seas of a woman's soul. But the cause of the change in her was something far less picturesque, something concrete and sinister. He felt sure of that. 7. But that was ridiculous, impossible. He sprang to his feet, incredulous, disgusted at the mere thought. But why not? She was very young, and older and wiser women were afflicted with inconsistencies, little tenacious desires and vanities, never quite to be grasped by the elemental male. He went over to a bookcase containing heavy works of reference, and pressed his index finger into the moulding. It swung outward, revealing the door of a safe. He manipulated the combination, took from a drawer of the interior a box, opened it, and stared at the magnificent Burmah ruby. It was, or had been, a royal jewel, presented to Masewell Price by one of the great princes of India, whose portrait he had painted. The pearls had all been captured long since by Price's sisters and by Morgan V. for his wife, but this ruby his mother had given him as she lay dying. She had bidden him leave it in his father's safe until he was out of college, and then keep it as closely in his personal possession as possible. It would be turned over to him with the rest of his private fortune. "Never let any woman wear it," she had whispered. "It brings luck to men, but not to women. Nothing could have affected my luck one way or the other. I was born to have nothing I wanted, but you, dear little boy. Keep it for your luck, and in a safe place, but near you." He had looked back upon this scene as he grew older as the mere expression of a whim of dissolution, but it had made so deep an impression upon him at the time that insensibly the words sank into his plastic mind, creating a superstition that refused to yield to reason. The ruby was Hélène's birthstone, and she was passionately fond of it. She had begged and coaxed to wear this jewel, and upon one occasion had stamped her little foot and sulked throughout the evening. He had given her a ruby bar, had the clasp of her pearl necklace set with rubies, and last Christmas had presented her with a small but fine pigeon blood encircled with diamonds. These had enraptured her for the moment, but she had always circled back to the historic stone, over which her indulgent husband was so unaccountably obstinate. Until lately. He recalled that for several months she had not mentioned it. Could she have been indulging in a prolonged attack of interior sulks, which affected her spirits, dimmed her radiant personality? He abominated the idea, but admitted the possibility. She would not be the first person to be the victim of a secret but furious passion for jewels. He recalled a novel of Hitchin's, not the matter but the central idea. Authors of other races had used the same motive. Well, if his wife had an abnormal streak in her, the sooner he found out the truth the better. He closed the door of the safe, swung the bookcase into place, slipped the ruby with its curious gold chain, that looked massive but hardly weighed an ounce, into his pocket, rang for a servant, and told him to ask Mrs. Ruyler to come down to the library as soon as she was dressed. Chapter 2